The title of my talk tonight is Helen Z.M. Rodgers and the Choice. For this is the choice of every sail, mimic life in a sheltered cove, or peril of wave and reef and gale, in the wide, wide seas to rove. This was a poem written by Helen Rodgers when she lived on Potomac Avenue in Buffalo, New York, and her life was certainly lived by this theme. She chose the peril of wave and reef and gale to pursue her life as a lawyer and a suffragist. So the early years, she was born in 1876 in Hornell, New York, and she moved with her parents, James Elbert Rodgers, and her mother, Zadie McMillan Rodgers, to New York City, where her father, who was a Civil War veteran, fighting for the Union side, and a hotelier, leased the historic Coleman House Hotel. Now, I know this is a little bit of an aside, but 2 years after leasing this hotel, there was an infamous event where a ne'er-do-well son of a wealthy stockbroker was shot by his mistress, Bertie Bell, who was a prostitute and a madam in New York City. And the New York Times article says, James Rodgers rushed to the hotel and unceremoniously removed the two women, the old mistress and the new mistress. Although Mr. Washington Nathan was shot in the head, he survived. The bullet remained in his head for the rest of the life. But the hotel on Coleman Street during the Victorian Era began to decline after this point in time. And Helen's father built the Hotel Castleton, which was in St. George on Staten Island, and it overlooked the water. And here's an ad that you can see for the Hotel Castleton, which says 900 feet of piazzas and pure air, every precaution against fire, and electric lights. So this was new at the time. Now, Helen's early childhood was one of comfortable wealth, and she attended private schools in New York City, including the Gargano School for Girls. And she has fond memories in her journals and letters of walking up Fifth Avenue to attend school at the Gargano School. However, the Rodgers fortunes would change, and the Hotel Castleton burned down. It was never rebuilt, and today there stands the Castleton Park Apartments in its place. Now, in 1897, Helen decided to come to Buffalo for law school. She came here, she never left. So many of us do that, I believe, in Buffalo. And in 1897, that was also the year that she married her husband, Elbert Rodgers. And they do have the same last name, but I was unable to track down if they were cousins or other relations. So she married Elbert Rodgers, but Elbert Rodgers was sort of an interesting character. Let me see if I can get to his picture there. He was 10 years her senior, and I'll tell you a little bit more about him in a minute. But I wanted to give you some context for what it was like in 1897 in the Victorian era. So here we have an era where electric lights don't replace gas lights till about 1901, and in fact it isn't until 1930 that about 15% of homes have electricity. So we're talking about a time where you had gas lights, you had ice boxes, not refrigerators because there was no electricity in the homes. You also had chamber pots and outhouses at most places. So it was a very different era. Also, women had to wear corsets, heeled shoes, long gowns or skirts, and hats when they went out in public. The primary mode of transportation were horse-drawn carriages, and motor cars were just starting to be produced. They looked like open-air carriages. Now, more seriously, were the rights that women had or the lack thereof. So at this point in time, women were just being allowed to hold property that they brought into the marriage. But this was tenuous in some states. Women didn't have the right to vote. Women also, who did work while they were married, did not have the right to their own wages. The wages were the property of the husband. If they were married and they got divorced or estranged from their husband, only the husband had control and dominion over the children. So they would lose their children if they were divorced. We already heard about how schooling, at this point in time, yes, more women are getting high school educations, but not going to college, let alone professional schools. And Judge Ferroletto had told us earlier about the fact that so many law schools didn't admit women until late in the 20th century. Now, however, I want to mention, because no discussion of Helen Z.M. Rodgers is complete without mentioning Cecilia Weiner. They entered law school at the same time in 1897, and they were both the first women graduates of Buffalo Law School, graduating together in 1899. They became very good friends in law school, and they supported each other after law school when they were out in the legal community. And both did very well. Cecilia Werner, she's in the black with the white scarf, and Helen Z.M. Rodgers is in the white with the black scarf. Now, Cecilia Werner, just to give you a little bit of history, after she graduated, she had a very successful private practice in Buffalo, but she went on to be the first woman judge in the children's court in Buffalo, which we all know was assumed later on by family court in Erie County. So I wanted to touch base with that because these women wrote letters to each other. This is before email and text, letters to each other, even though they lived relatively in the same area for their entire lives. So here's Elbert, affectionately called Budge Rodgers. Budge and Helen married in 1897, right before she started law school, and it was a very unconventional marriage. They did not live together at first. Not only that, but Helen said, "We had many agreements and understandings before being married, the chief of which was that I would retain my full and complete liberty of action." She also went on to say they understood she would have her own career and that she would keep her own name instead of being called Mrs. Elbert Rodgers. It was Mrs. Helen Rodgers, which was actually something very different for the time frame. Now, Elbert was 10 years her senior, and he agreed to pay some expenses for law school, but these expenses, as Helen wrote in her journals, were a loan to be paid back as soon as possible. Now, this one you might not be able to read as well, but I just wanted to give you some idea of the highlights. In 1899, Helen Rodgers graduates from law school. Her husband at this time is suffering from poor health and facing bankruptcy. But she herself is looking at an entire year of unpaid work in a clerkship before she can be admitted. So she's worrying at this point in time. There's something called the Clinton Award for the highest grade in a course. And she was worrying because she thought it had been a shoo-in, but when she took the exam, it bore no relationship to what was taught in class. That sounds familiar, even 127 years later. I hear that sometimes from students. Luckily, however, she did pull it out and win the Clinton Award, and there was a small monetary amount that she got, which helped them in these lean times. However, by 1901, her legal career was underway. And in fact, in 1901, she was the first woman to argue before the New York Court of Appeals in McGuire versus Bell Telephone Company. She represented Bell Telephone Company of Buffalo. And what's interesting about this is the New York Times actually published an article, Woman Lawyer in Court of Appeals. And in addition to confirming she's the first woman to appear before the New York Court of Appeals, it also says the appearance of a woman before the Court of Appeals caused considerable interest, and there was a large assemblage present to hear her argument. No pressure, right? In 1902, she wrote a law review article called Married Women's Earnings, which was published in the Albany Law Journal. This law review article, published in 1902, has been cited many times. And in fact, today, if you looked at texts for women's history, women's rights, you'll see citations to that article in those texts, so very recently. In 1903, she has her first and only child, a daughter, who is named after her mother, so Zadie McMillan Rodgers. Now, there's a lot that happens between that time and this case, but in 1905, Helen actually gives a speech for Susan B. Anthony in Jamestown for Susan B. Anthony's 85th birthday party. So I think that should tell you a little bit of how involved Helen Rodgers was in the suffragist movement. In 1920, she argues in 1919, the decisions issued in 1920 before the U.S. Supreme Court. And she had been sick right prior to the argument. And Elbert Moot, for those of you who are from the Buffalo area, you may have heard of Moot and Sprague. Moot, Sprague, Bromwell, and Marcy. And Moot and Sprague actually has had many reincarnations through the years, through the generations here in Buffalo. And there's still a group of people who sort of trace their lineage back to Moot and Sprague. But Elbert Moot was the person, Helen Rodgers was working for them by 1906. And he is a person who, even though during this time frame when there weren't many women lawyers, was writing to her as she was sick to say, get better, read some light reading, Balzac, Thackeray. For any of you who are literature people, that's not light reading, but he was making a joke. One of my favorite things about doing the research here was learning about Elbert Moot, because he really promoted her career at a time when there just weren't many women lawyers, and became a great mentor to her, and just sounds like a fabulous addition to the Buffalo bar, the Erie County bar. But she argues her first Supreme Court case in 1919. So here's someone that may sound familiar to many of you. John Lord O'Brien. We're sitting in a building that is named after John Lord O'Brien. And he, in fact, argued against Helen Rodgers many times. And this is one article that was published about $1 million case in which they were opposing counsel argued before the appellate division. But O'Brien actually said about Rodgers, I would rather argue against almost any other attorney than Helen Rodgers, because I've lost almost every jury trial where we've been opposing counsel. So she really was a formidable lawyer. And of course, she was a suffragist, and in her own words, people called her an agitator. So she was out all the time advocating for women's rights, and not just the vote. Not just the vote. She did so much in this area for women in pay, women in better employment opportunities. She actually did an entire study where they went out and canvassed in Erie County where women were working, what they were paid, what the working conditions were like. So she did a tremendous amount of work in that area, and also economic development generally in Buffalo. She wrote many articles about getting the right to vote for women, one including lauding the march in D.C. that women made to seek the right to vote. So here what you see on the screen is the flower and ribbon that her daughter, who was 14 years old at the time, wore on November 6, 1917, when women won the vote in New York, 3 years before the 19th Amendment. If I had made a list of all the committees, of all the speeches given, of all the work that she did for different organizations where she was not paid, I would have started at the beginning of my talk and just be about ending now. I mean, the amount of work she did was just unbelievable. But here's one that if you're from the Western New York area, you've heard of the Larkin Company, and she was on the Larkin's Women Council. Okay. After women won the right to vote, this is a bulletin from 1921, and Helen Rodgers is on here, and she's talking about fundamental rights secured by the Constitution. She would go out and educate women on their rights, on important legal issues, on important social issues, so that these women were educated citizens and educated voters. She spoke on so many issues. In 1933, she spoke out against racism and against anti-Semitism in Germany. She spoke out about Roosevelt's third term before World War II. So she had a practice that ran about 50 years, or actually over 50 years, and she continued to advocate up until her death in 1960. Here's one little issue I want to tell you about. She was elected by her district to go to the New York State Constitutional Convention in 1938, and when she got there, she was elected to chair the convention, and she was the first woman to ever do so. This I just put in there because I really love the picture, and she was just so involved with the League of Women Voters in every way in Erie County. But now I do need to turn to my notes for a second, because I want to say, in forging our own paths, I ask you to remember these women pioneers, and not as giants whose careers that we can never duplicate, but as people who cleared the path or started to clear the path for us. That remember, they supported each other, they walked arm in arm to earn these rights. And so today, we can take solace in their courage as we continue to clear the path for women in our profession, because it's not over yet. As wonderful it is to see all these women judges and women law students, we know women are bleeding from the profession, especially after having children. We're not at the highest levels yet in the numbers that we need to be in courts, in academia, in partnerships at firms. So take courage in their strength and in their sisterhood as we continue to forge our paths. Thank you very much.